Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Each episode has its own accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence of Gestalt language processing, associated therapy modalities, and how our field is responding to the frameworks of GLP and NLA.
My name is Jamie Burch. I am a pediatric speech-language pathologist specializing in supporting autistic youth along with their families and team members. And I solely support autistic youth and neurodivergent youth as well as Gestalt language processors. I love supporting AAC users. And while AAC and Gestalt language processing doesn't have a lot of information out there quite yet, I love troubleshooting it and figuring out as I go to support that clientele.
That's awesome. How did you start to realize that you wanted to niche down to working with autistic children, AAC, and the framework of Gestalt language processing?
So I've always known that I've wanted to support the autistic community. That's why I became a speech language pathologist after, adult sitting when I was in high school. And so I was like, okay, this is for me. These are my people. And then when it came to supporting Gestalt language processors, I basically found out that a lot of what I was doing wasn't actually helpful for the autistic community. So much of what I learned to do and goals that I was taught to write weren't actually affirming to the autistic community. And so about 3-4 years ago, I started listening more to autistic voices. I started learning about Gestalt language processing. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I want everyone to know about this. Holy cow. And I ended up leaving the private practice that I was working at for the past 8 years and started my own company, Inclusion Therapy Services, where it's just myself and I go to other people's homes or out in the community to provide therapy just in natural settings, in the bedroom, in the living room, in the kitchen, at the grocery store. And it's been really, really awesome.
One of the main topics that we talk about on the Gestalt Get Together is the application of music and psychoacoustics for language acquisition, particularly when we think about Gestalt language processors. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with music?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I feel like is a fluke or meant to be, that I do have a background in music. And what that looks like for me isn't anything professional. It is, I was in my high school's musicals and I used to sing at weddings with my dad as like a part-time gig. My mom plays the piano, my whole extended family sings. And so Gestalt language processing was putting my love of communication and my love of music together, which felt like it was just meant to be there for me, just waiting. And so I always sing. I'm always singing and humming and whistling all the time. And so yeah, this just felt like something that was meant to be a little bit. My two loves of communication and music came together.
Well, you definitely know I relate to that. This is going to be the least evidence-based thing I ever say, but theater kids make the best pediatric speech language pathologists.
Right? I mean, hey, here we are.
So I can hear how much passion you have for working with these children, especially in the natural environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to hear a little bit more about, in particular, supporting them with AAC devices. What are some of the softwares that you enjoy working with, as well as what are some of the things in your toolbox to gear these devices and softwares toward GLPs?
Yeah, so I don't want to put any one system on blast. I think we could probably all agree that none of these AAC apps were created with Gestalt language processors in mind. But also, Gestalt language processing in working with those kids, everything has to be so individualized. Individualized thinking about what their special interests are, what they watch, what songs they're into, because it's always different. It's not the same for everybody. And so I'm constantly thinking about how, one, something can be individualized. Two, I'm constantly thinking about what are their loves and how can I incorporate that, because communication should be enjoyable. It should be fun. It shouldn't feel like work. And I feel super strongly about that. And if you watched one of my sessions, you'd be like, whoa, we're having fun. And then I really also I'm just going to go into it. For me, lamp words for life doesn't work for my gestalt language processors that I've seen so far. And I say that like a little begrudgingly because I've had kids in the past where I'm like, this is the system that I recommended. It was me. I'm the one who recommended it. And then, there's guilt heavily attached to that because I'm like, man, if only I knew what I knew now when I was recommending that device. So that's a bummer looking back on that. Ones that I'm having way more success with right now, touch chat. Whoa. To me, this one, I'm like, did we know about gestalt language processing a little bit when we made this? Because the sentence predicting nature almost feels like stage 2. I'll talk about my programming in a little bit, but that part feels like stage 2. I have spaces where I can, put gestalts in categories. When I'm pressing something, I'm still staying in the same area. So that's really awesome. It's not going back to that homepage. That's just what happens a lot with LAMP. And I also had so much progress with Snap Core. Unfortunately, though, they decided to change their subscription. And so now it is paying monthly instead of a one-time payment. And so that's decreased my ability to use that right now just because of being realistic for my families. But right now, the one I'm having the most progress with across the board is touch chat and using word power 60 basic.
That's great to know. I know that's one of the biggest conversations that AAC SLPs have when it comes to programming for kids who are more melodically driven, drawn to information that taps into episodic memory, is what kind of software is going to capture what we are perceiving to be a different learning style, not as much that single word motor planning. And I still very much so believe that motor planning is a big deal for any person who's learning to use a device to communicate. But is there that limitation of monotonous single words dispersed in a way that may not make sense to someone who is learning language? And I think what we're going to talk about quite a bit today is being able to record and access types of media on these AAC softwares that something like LAMP Words for Life is not going to be able to provide.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear about what is currently in your toolbox for programming icons for Gestalt language processors.
So one quick note, even before I answer that one, is this is also taking into consideration whether or not a device is dedicated or not, because a dedicated AAC device also doesn't have access to do some of the things that an undedicated device can do, like access to making videos and putting them on. So that's one of those tools. Is I will often record a video and it might have that child in it. And so an example would be, I have a little boy who loves water. And I mean, that is our preferred toy. That's our special interest. That's our favorite sensory, tool. And watching it in the sunlight, he'll kind of take a bowl and move it back and forth with a bowl of water. And doing it in the sunlight is like his glimmer. And so, that glimmer of like just immense joy. And so I added a gestalt that said, that's the best. And I modeled it and I took a picture of it in the water. And he looked at it and he watched me access it. And I was like, well, that's great. But it really didn't, I feel like it sounds like that's the best, I was like, okay. And this was at the beginning. This is before I had put a video on an AAC device. And I was like, it's not really capturing it. Like, that's not really it, because that's not how I say that's the best. And so what I did was I took a video of the water in the sun as he was moving it. And then it was my voice and I was going, that's the best. And then you can hear him squeal in the background because he's so excited. And so I put that video. So when he presses the button, that's the best, it actually says, that's the best. And you can see the water move and you can hear his squeal. And that's immense joy. And to me, that's probably the best tool that I've discovered, is the ability to record videos with rich intonation, with a memory or something meaningful and purposeful and important to that child, again, individualized. And then if they're able to vocalize in it as well, or they're able to be in it, I have another one where, already on the device is under social is this little script. I love it. And it has a little heart. And so now when he presses it, it's also him. It's like a video of him beaming and rocking and looking right at the camera and smiling so big. And I'm like, and he was so joyful in that time. I was like, this is a perfect time to capture it. So making sure there are videos that are, again, purposeful and meaningful to the child. That would be a big one. I also try to incorporate music as much as I possibly can, because we know that most of our Gestalt language processors also love music. And so I am recording YouTube videos and putting them on there. I'm recording just the audio of those videos from the source. Sometimes it's whether it's Daniel Tiger or the movie Sing or Frozen, whatever, and putting that incorporated so that when they're pressing the button, they're hearing it from the original source as well. Sometimes I'm not able to figure out what that original source is. Then we have to just settle for my voice. But yeah, those are my biggest tools right now.
That's great to know. I think that tapping into the visual sense, ability to take in visual information, particularly if it's attached to that emotional, relevant context of what that phrase means, is something that a lot of people who are in this space talk about and discuss, is this concept of episodic memory. Being able to pull from a distinct moment in time or distinct episode that is multisensory. All of those elements are part of a distinct package of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And using the intonation, the melody, the rhythm of what we hear, as well as like even that squeal in the background. I have several recorded icons or gestalts or potential gestalts where hearing that the child hears themselves in the background, and that's the main event for them.
Yeah, and it's so joyful. And I have kids where, again, they're non-speaking in the sense that I'm not hearing any true words come, but they're constantly vocalizing. And again, their vocalizations are rich in intonation. It sometimes just sounds like they're singing. Some of them aren't making any consonant noises, but the joy is there. And when we play those, and I say when we play those, when he accesses those gestalts, he's then verbalizing that piece that he had in the video. And I think there would also be like a understanding or a concern that then that wouldn't generalize, not just water is the best, other things are the best too. We don't just love, but it does generalize, because then they're able to see, oh no, that's that feeling of pure joy, is that I love something that much as I love water. That's the best feeling. And then when he eats Oreos, it's also the best, and he will access it. That's the best. When we open a fresh pack of Oreos, he will access it. And so he's not getting it stuck there. It's just that he can really truly get the feeling. And I know that so many of my kids are visual learners, and I feel like tying a visual, seeing the word, hearing himself, all those aspects together really helped hone that and make it a gestalt for him.
Yeah, and that's what we talk about, is this concept of a gestalt. It has to be personal. It's tapping into an individualized understanding of what a sequence of phonemes might be attached to. So much of language, other than onomatopoeia, is an arbitrary sequence of sounds that we as humans decided upon many, 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 many years ago. Language also shifts. So there's so much arbitrary to it, but when it's attached to, at least this is my claim and the claim of other people who do really cool qualitative research on this, is that by bringing in that multisensory context, that memory, but especially the musicality of it, musical input tends to activate the memory centers and memory pathways and the reward centers and pathways more efficaciously than just linguistic input. And so we can do some sense making of this, that if we're tapping into that musicality, which inherently may play upon memory centers and reward centers, and that can map onto the emotion of the moment, it may be easier to call upon when that emotion arises again, or when they want that emotion to rise again.
That is so true. Sorry, that's just a really good point.
I'm also thinking about when it comes to videos. So with the success, I know I've seen, my colleagues have seen, what you're sharing as well, is that by tapping into taking a video of a real moment that happened, an authentic moment, not some engineered moment. This concept of video modeling has been explored for at least 20 years now. Some exciting work came out in 2004 to 2008. There's one study from 2005. It's by Corbett and Abdullah, and it's video modeling. Why does it work for children with autism? And one of the claims that they were wanting to explore was that providing video information about a situation that you'd love that child to learn from or grow from is that visual information, particularly in a video, and think about how small our phones or iPads are, it restricts the field of focus that child needs to attend to rather than the wide world around them or the big space. So it restricts the field of focus. It also doesn't place a ton of demand on their ability to interact or social attention. It's them and that, that sequence of pixels that you took of a real moment. Then if you can lump in the social learning context to that reduced field of focus as well as the reduced demands, by them seeing themselves in this social moment, for example, the water, the light playing upon it, the sound of the laugh or the squeal in the background, we may be speaking to some of the reasons why video can be so helpful. There's also the fact that when you capture a video of something or an audio recording of something, a child is able to repeat that as many times as they want, and the acoustic qualities, unless you change the volume or speed it up and slow it down, do not change. Think about the way that many autistic individuals play. There's a high degree of repetition, high focus. It's like seeing a scientist in action. They then, at least the kids on my caseload, many of the people I talk to, and I'm sure as you as well, by engaging in all that repetition, it's almost like they're studying the moment, and the acoustic parameters do not change.
Can I say something really quick? I think that also gives them more confidence to potentially attempt it verbally, because they are able to. I have, and this is where I feel like they say he's playing with it. Oh, he just likes it because it's your voice. I have so many, he just loves Miss Jamie's voice. I'm like, no, that's not what he's doing. And this happened twice today, where they're pressing a gestalt and it's my voice and they're saying it. Pressing a gestalt and it's a video and an audio, and they're watching it and listening it, watching it and listening it. And they're also watching the words go across the top too. So there's so many, because hyperlexia and gestalt language processing also go hand in hand. And so when they're getting all of that, they're listening to it, and it's consistent every single time, and looking at the words, and there's a visual. I mean, all of those things, I think it would, for those who have the ability to potentially verbalize, it has, I think, been a confidence booster. And it's just a constant model, like a consistent model. It's the same every single time. And so for two of these kids just today, and I've seen this happen before, but today it was so awesome that it was two kids back to back, where one of them was high five, and he was high five, high five. And I was like, high five, high five. That's what it sounds like. And so I saw his mouth starting to move, and I was like, that looks just like it. And then all of a sudden he goes, high five, with my rich intonation, watching the video, and that same thing happened with another friend. But if it was just high five, would that be enough that they would want to try it? Maybe, maybe not. But having, I think, all of that in there has made it to where it's a consistent model. It has the rich intonation. It's everything that they're wanting. And then it gives them something to, basically study. And it's the same every time. And it maybe gives them more confidence to be able to attempt it until they know they can. They've heard it enough repetitions, and they've studied it. He's moving his mouth, and then he's able to produce it. Again, that's not the same for everybody. That won't be the case for every kid, but it has been really cool. And I saw it twice today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You're kind of tapping into this idea that's related to video modeling and often cited in research related to video modeling. This is definitely an older framework. It's by Bandura in 1986, but they laid out this idea of observational learning. Observational learning is, we could potentially tie that to what we're seeing in gestalt language processors when they have that video or that audio, or really what we see them doing when they're rewinding that same scene of Moana over and over. Or
it's like a study.
They're engaging in study. And I also have some older kids who, when they realize that they can do slow motion, I think really the joy that I see in that ability to manipulate auditory signals that are attached to strong memories is, it's something I'm not willing to ignore. And it
Yeah.
really does relate back to this idea of, it's called observational learning. And Bandura laid out this idea that there are 4 distinct processes that mediate and then help with observational learning. So there's attentional, which we're thinking about kids really paying attention to that video. There's retentional, so the ability to retain that information.
Mm-hmm.
There's production, which you reference with that child over and over again, and then high five, that's a production. But then there's also the motivational part of it. So with attentional processes, which is that first part, that is this vicarious acquisition when we attend to something, when we accurately perceive a model of the event. So I think about gestalt processors who they see something one time and it is locked in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about one of my earliest clients, the one who really sparked in me to investigate music theory and the math of music related to how he was processing the world. One time we were walking out of the gate at school, I went down to his level and I went, "Here we go." I was right in his attention, and he was he was perceiving that model within the event. And that felt like an attentional process was happening, because right away, his eyes got wide, "Here we go." And he said it every single time when we left that gate. So attentional processing, it requires a child to take in that sensory stimuli of what's happening, but focusing on the specific task or event. Something I talk about often when I'm coaching people about using music, working with Gestalt language processors, is that there's really interesting work about sensory processing and autism. We know it's inherently different.
Mm-hmm.
One of the claims or the ideas in investigating this is that there is this increased or enhanced perceptual capacity and I know this to be true, and looking into this related to the ADHD neurotype, that because neurodivergent brains are taking in so much more information, it's harder to know what is the signal and what is the noise.
Mm-hmm.
So when the attentional process that Bandura talks about is engaged, GLPs that I've worked with, it's clear that they're taking in sensory stimuli and they know what it's related to. What is this event that's happening? Rather just than the constant barrage of sensory information coming in that it may be hard to make events of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's attentional. Does that remind you of any kids you've worked with?
I mean, all of them. Well, and especially in the sense of, I like what you said about, their brains are taking in so much information. And it would be so easy for my voice to just get lost in the noise, and I have kids, and I have kids who are auditory sensory seekers. And so I have a little friend where it's like, "Hey Alexa, turn on Kids Bop," and whatever. And I mean, we need the TV on, we need Netflix on, we've got 2 iPads going. We are visually and auditorily like stimulated. I think it is really easy for potentially our voices to just get lost in the noise, because we do know that so many of our autistic kids are taking in, and adults are taking in so much information. And so I think it would be so easy for my voice to just if I'm not making sure it is something that is meaningful and purposeful to them, if I'm not getting down on their level, if I'm not using rich intonation, using something that maybe they're familiar with, whatever it may be, my voice just gets lost in the noise. Kind of like maybe when we're just calling their name, it just gets lost in the noise. It's background noise. And I have a little girl that I support who is an auditory seeker. So we have music on, we have Netflix on, we have 2 iPads going. So we are visually and auditorily like, woo, we're getting all the input. And it would be so easy for my voice to get lost in that. But because I'm making sure that I'm down on her level, and I'm really attuned to what her interests are, what she's doing, what she's looking at. I don't have my own agenda where I'm like, we need to come do this, and I'm pushing into her world. I think that helps in that. Then there's buy-in. It separates my voice and those potential gestalts from the noise.
Mm-hmm. And you are inherently making yourself part of that specific task or event that is in her attentional process.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next part of the Bandura framework or concept relates a lot to what we were talking about before with programming icons on AAC. So retentional process, this is when a GLP or an autistic child, they figure out how to symbolically process what we're modeling. It's not just processing the sensory information. Oh, Jamie's mouth did this and her arms went up. It's the ability to map that onto symbols. And symbols are that higher level map of the sensory information coming in. So what does it take for retention to occur? How does it move from attention to retention? This is when what's modeled for us or for kids through these videos, it's when what's modeled, these events, I'm going to keep going back to the sunlight on the water because that is a beautiful, very clear image. It's when that modeled event is coded internally. We can't really decide what the symbology is going to mean in those early days, those early stages. It has to be internally coded into a meaningful symbol for that child, and then it can be stored in memory. And so going that direction of, can we join in the attentional focus or create attentional focus that is hard to ignore? For example, using musical strategies. If I'm just talking like this to a child, there's not a lot of rhythm, there's not a lot of pattern to it, it's a bit hard to predict. But if I'm talking to you like this, you can probably predict that I'm gonna use more breakdowns of the groups of four that are in Western music. So much of Western music boils down to groupings or can be divided by four. It's a lot more predictable. Now, from that attentional process, either that we're creating something that's impossible to ignore or by just joining in, like with the two iPads, the Netflix, the music, that opens up where retention can happen. Again, meaningful symbol encoding for that kid. Does that remind you of anybody?
Yes, but I'm nervous. I'm jumping to the next one.
Do it. Jump.
Okay.
Do it.
So for me, I'm gonna look just at AAC for a second because that is so many of the kids that I support, and I have access to it with everybody that I support because we need that. And so in regards to that, I have a category. I do a lot more categorical based than just motor planning. I try to include motor planning as well, but let's say we're in touch chat. Okay. And so pretend you can see touch chat, word power 60. I'm going to groups. Within groups, I also have a scripts or potential gestalts subcategory there that I'm going to click and it's going to bring me to all of these. Okay. In that one, I've got toileting for this friend who loves water, the sunlight on the water. I have a whole category of just water because in there he has give me a bowl, turn it on, do it again, make it hot because he wants hot water, make it hot. That's the best, like those. So where I start, and I think a great way that I am getting that retention is if we're going to be playing with water, I'm already in that category. It seems backwards. He's not seeing all the steps for me to get there right away. And I think the retention, this is where I'm nervous, I'm jumping ahead, but I think the retention is in the fact that it's quick. And so initially, the buy-in is right there because it's happening. And in that moment, I'm immediately able to say it. It's not taking me 4 hits. Once he's accessed, this is where I'm jumping ahead. Once he's accessed it or he's shown so much interest, and again, this is just one example because we're with this friend who loves the sunlight on the water. Once he's shown interest or we've had like bingo eye contact and he looks at me like, whoa, that's what I was thinking, look at you, then I take one step back and I go back and now he sees those categories. He sees bathroom transitions, sensory integration, whatever, feelings, and then he sees me hit water, and then that's the best. And so I think the retention maybe comes with, you can have all the right words, but still the implementation of how to model those is tricky. And so doing it that way for me has been amazing. And it's also like, just to call my old self out, it has made it to where kids that 5 year ago, Jamie, wouldn't have thought these kids would be able to do this. And now I'm able to like just prove myself wrong. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how could you think that, old Jamie? Like, what? Oh my gosh. And I'm like, oh my gosh, and like really presuming competence, because these are kids that I would have given 4 buttons to, 8 years ago. And now we've got access to all of these amazing things. But it started with seeing me hit it one time. It was just a 1 hit. And then I moved it to a 2 hit. And then I moved it to a 3 hit without ever hiding anything. So yeah, I think that kind of hopefully speaks to that retention piece.
Yeah, and I think you're also speaking to one of my favorite techniques for so many things that we work on is backwards chaining.
Yeah.
And that was something that I learned from a beloved RBT at my previous position, who they were working on tying shoes. And I mean, I haven't thought about how to tie my shoes since I was a kid, but it's a complicated process. And she explained to me, oh, I'm using something called backwards chaining. And she was explaining it. And I remember sitting there and being like, oh my gosh, I can use this for AAC.
Yeah.
Because looking at the totality of all the buttons, and at that time I was like too scared to mask anything, not yet knowing about like visual overwhelm, as well as like having relevant buttons to a 2-year-old. Like a 2-year-old, this again, like this is the way that I practice, and some people might be uncomfortable with this. A 2-year-old, in my understanding and application of supporting grammar, isn't necessarily ready for like certain types of vocabulary. Like I probably will mask those. Like,
Might be okay.
right? Yeah. Or even like certain types of verb forms that I have no idea how I could model that or integrate that into a clear understanding for you at this time. And so, but being able to engage in that backwards chaining from exactly that thing that is going to hit right away.
Yeah.
Because I know that for the kids, a lot of the kids that I work with, because they're so excited to study all the balls in the ball pit, or they really want to engage with studying the wheels of the Matchbox car.
Yeah.
It is my job to provide the value from the jump. If they have to wait for that value, or for like, what's the point of this? I'll probably lose them. They've got something more interesting to attend to, but exactly. Start with the most like exciting, meaningful thing for that exact moment. Also, because like you're going to lose that moment, you probably have to model something like totally
Right.
new. And then exactly going back a hit or a folder, then going back. That's completely what I do as well.
Yeah.
Something else I've been doing, and this is on certain software, is there's the ability to hold that button rather than just tapping through the buttons. Hold it. It changes color a little. So then my clients can see the visual difference. Okay, like this lady is holding down this button. It looks slightly different. Maybe that's where it's going to go next. And that's been really helpful for that backwards chaining, for that motor plan to get to the thing they actually want, which is the gestalt.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So much of what you're speaking to reminds me of one of Bandura's processes, which is the motivational process. And that is that deeper learning, they theorize, is happening in the presence of some sort of reinforcement. And reinforcement doesn't just have to be that external arbitrary reinforcement that a lot of people in our field are very wary of, like a Cheeto, or perhaps being provided your favorite car after you do something completely unrelated. The reinforcement and reward that many of us are looking for, especially when we work with Gestalt processors, and I know for me, Gestalt processors with a demand avoidant profile, is that intrinsic motivation, that intrinsic reward of, I am rewarded by being part of this interaction, not because I'm going to get something out of it after. And what Bandura talks about is that whether or not an individual or a child is going to truly adopt something that is modeled, whether that's from us or in a video of themselves doing it, is if they perceive it's going to result in some sort of desired outcome. And that desired outcome isn't a Cheeto or that car. It's, I'm getting to experience something that feels really good. Yep.
So I think a huge part of that is there is obviously reinforcement in this, but for me, I feel like the biggest reinforcements are connection, shared joy, or just being heard, because it's not always connection and shared joy. It's typically connection, but not always shared joy. We're not joyful the whole hour, because guess what? We get dysregulated. We get upset because it's time to go, whatever it may be. So sometimes it is the reinforcer is the feeling of being heard. And so much of that is also, even when I'm providing potential gestalts for advocacy, self-advocacy, or potential gestalts for saying things like, I don't like this, I don't want to go, stop it. And then that you can see, once you've put words or given them potential gestalts for how they're feeling, even though maybe it's a negative feeling, then all of a sudden something that would have been maybe a huge meltdown or a bigger negative behavior, whatever you want to call it, actually is like not as bad, And so I had someone who I realized that the gestalt was ouch, and it was overgeneralized to anything that was non-preferred. It was very confused. They thought something was wrong. We're taking a doctor. What's going on? And it wasn't until I was able to say, like, I don't like that. That's the worst, And that then was the reinforcement there was the fact that, oh my gosh, she gets me. I feel heard. And I feel like that the reinforcement, so many people like to use tactile reinforcements. You get a Skittle, you get a Skittle. We're all Oprah giving out Skittles. But instead of doing that, the reinforcement is connection. I mean, that I feel like is it. That's it. In those more negative circumstances where we're wanting to advocate for ourselves in our space, get away from me. I added on a device today, leave me alone. And you better believe when he accessed that button that I left him alone. How else is he going to understand what that means if I don't leave him alone in that moment? And so it doesn't look like connection because I physically left his space, but it was. And he looked at me and he was like, oh my gosh, you could see it in his eyes. Like, she honored it. And so then after a while he would say, play with me. And then I'd come back over and he was like testing it. Like, does this button work? Leave me alone. And he'd like look at me, and I left. And you could see, he was like, oh my gosh, I hold power. And that, despite me leaving, was connection. And that was the reinforcement there.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're reminding me of just about a week ago, I had a family come in. Child's language is taking off. She's extremely high masking, ADHD girly, and she still is a Gestalt language processor. She's starting to break things down, some really nice stage 3, which is referring to when kids start to realize the power of isolated units that can be combined like Legos. But her moms came in, and it's funny because I was going to talk about potentially setting up, some steps for reducing, or because they're doing great at home and we don't need like all that support and input if they're thriving. But they came in, they looked really nervous. They're like, is it okay if we talk about like hitting and tantrums? And I was like, yes, please. Mm-hmm. And we talked about some of the feelings that have been coming up, how it's impacting their daily routine. And they had had a couple really hard weeks of hitting, of screaming. And I talked about what I was going to do. I was going to model the phrases with the intonation and the emotion that, as best as I could match what this child was experiencing. And they still looked worried. They said she might hit you. And I said, awesome.
Right.
That would be so dope, because then it is authentic to what she's doing at home.
Yeah.
Or I had a 12-year-old client last week who I was doing something that he perceived to be wrong. I wasn't following a procedure. I was being too silly. And he reached out and he slapped me. And I was so excited about this because it gave me an authentic opportunity. By the way, in a space that doesn't have real world consequences. It's like what I like to refer to as a brave space. Like, you can explore that here with me.
Yes. And it's safe.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's safe to do that. And that's so necessary, because when they're hitting out, out in the real world, then it's like, don't do that. We don't hit. But then we're not providing them with what to do instead. We're not providing them with the language. We're saying, don't hit, say sorry. But really what we can be doing is like, I hate this. Like, that's what we want to model. And so and that's exactly what we can do. Be like, I hate this. Or, we can pull stuff from shows that we know that they watch, or, whatever it may be, but providing them potential ways to express themselves other than this, because if we don't have the words, guess what? I'm going to slap you too. Like, what do we have?
Exactly. And that, I think about like the path of least resistance. If we need to communicate something, we're usually going to go on the path of least resistance. And if you don't have a lexicon to draw from, or even with, for kids who may be non-speaking, pre-speaking with praxis difficulties, moving my mouth is really tough,
Right.
especially if I don't have access to the symbology to reflect these feelings. It may be that my hands and my feet are getting the message across. And I think what's cool about this topic of talking about like communicating with hits and kicks and slaps and all of that is this actually does bridge into that fourth process, the production process. And this is that stage in observational learning where we then take the symbols we've acquired and translate them into action. And this capacity to engage in like rudimentary elements of a certain task, it has to be in that individual's repertoire and then built upon. And so what we're seeing is that this child is experiencing this emotion in the moment. We can then provide something, a symbol or a set of symbols that matches that. Then can we translate emotion into symbol into new action? Now, for the kids we're working with sensory differences, with praxis differences, that child is likely going to rely on a higher degree of feedback from a model so that they can engage in self-correction, make adjustments, understand it better. And to bring it all back home, feedback from a model, they can get as much feedback as they need from videos and from audio recordings on an AAC device. And so all of this really speaks to what we're talking about and the modifications we can make to the softwares that, are available to us to bring these units of meaning to life in a way that may work better for the children that we're working with.
And I think production, I think it gets tricky because I think that that's the piece that so many SLPs and professionals focus on. Of all of those aspects of everything that we've gone over, I think so many times we just focus on production because we want data. And that's the part that we can actually, of all the things that we've talked about, this is the part that we can have like hard objective data. And I think that people get lost on production because they forget all those other pieces, and all those other pieces are really important. And I think production is amazing. And I think that no matter, again, I think it's important to state that I don't care how they communicate these things, but I think it's easy to get lost in this one piece when I actually think, I don't want to say this is the least important piece because it's not. We want them to produce it. But I think it's easy to get stuck in just this piece and forget all the others, because I feel like so often we just jump to this, jump to this, whatever stage this is, the fourth one or the third one. And yeah, we wouldn't be able to get to this production had we skipped any of those other steps.
Yes.
Because these are naturally acquired. And again, often in then natural situations. And I think of Jesse Ginsburg, I know, talked about like the language staircase, talking about intrinsic motivation, co-regulation, and I want to say it's like attending. And then understanding what drives them and what motivates them and what brings them joy and how to use that, and using a strengths-based approach. I mean, it's more complicated than it looks, because it looks like we're just playing and singing songs, but we're not. There's so many invisible layers to what we're doing and why we're doing it, whether it's the song choice that we're choosing, the rhythm or melodies that we're choosing to model for this specific client that we don't use for somebody else, why I might be squeezing his feet while I'm doing this, why I'm giving him big bear hugs every couple of minutes. It's not because I just like to hug. It's because I know that that's helpful in co-regulation. And I know that that melody is something that he's used before. So I'm going to attach to it and try another potential gestalt with it. And so there's rhyme or reason to everything that we're doing. And it just looks like play.
So I think being able to create, look at the qualitative input and then try find ways to quantify that is really especially for people who don't have private practice, who are looking to insurance companies to provide reimbursement. How can we creatively craft goals and objectives and engage in measurement that don't jeopardize like the deep attunement work that we're doing as the foundation of language acquisition for these kids.
I think that little note about like even to insurance, because I felt like for a long time, if you looked at my treatment plan and then you looked at how I actually practiced, it was like, who wrote the treatment plan? Because it couldn't have been this chick. And I think it's because I wasn't writing goals that of things that I was actually also paying attention to. And those are the things that I would put in my subjective portion. And I would be writing narratives in these notes. I'm like, oh my gosh, and this he did this and he did this and this was amazing. Because you can't always quantify the look that they give you when you hit the nail on the head. But also maybe you can, you know? And so it does call for some creativity. And by no means am I ever going to call myself an expert in anything, honestly, because I will always be learning. And this whole process of learning and unlearning has been extremely humbling. And has really knocked me down a few notches as I continue to be a learner for the rest of my life. And so I think, by no means do I even feel like I'm in a point where I'm like, this is how to do it, because it's going to be ever changing. We're going to hopefully keep listening to autistic voices and keep listening to Gestalt language processors and let their voices guide how we can be creative and work together and being creative and how we can better serve this community and this population.
Yeah, and I think like your openness and willingness to talk about how, especially like with previous clients, looking back and being like, oh my gosh, what was I doing? I have this too. I wish I could gather them all in a room and say, I'm so sorry, let's try that again. But that's not how any of this works.
Mm-hmm.
Every day, people are doing really cool brain scans and really cool inquiry into all these big questions we have. We don't know what we don't know. And I think it's really important to stay as much as you can on the side of, I can't wait to know more.
Mm-hmm.
And I always feeling like there's more digging to do. Just today, I spent 3 hours hyper focusing on looking into synaptogenesis. What does synaptogenesis look like in child brains? How are we able to study this in human brains rather than just mice and rat models? And I learned so much that I didn't even know I didn't even know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also a word of caution that as we turn to other professionals to learn from them, me included, you included, to be wary of anyone who seems to have an answer for everything, to be wary of anyone who isn't open to critique, criticism, or alternative viewpoints, and also be wary of those who aren't able to cite sources in a really robust way and seem to engage in circular logic, because those are signs to me of individuals and practitioners who aren't being really curious about what else is out there, where they may be wrong, and that's where creativity really seems to stop. So I love conversations like this where we're talking about AAC and Gestalt language processing. There aren't a ton of like solid resources out there. All of us are trying to figure this out as we go. I feel like as long as we're pulling from really interesting ideas and research from a variety of disciplines, I think only looking in the ASHA journals or speech therapy journals, we're extremely limited when we do that. But let's look outward. Let's look to people who are being creative in different ways so that we can show up and be as creative as we need to be with our clients, rather than looking for something that has a bunch of steps or arguably only 6 stages when human beings are not that simple. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more about AAC, Gestalt language processing, how to bring these together, how to bring in more musicality, which is something I'd love to explore even further in a future episode. Perhaps we need to have you back, Jamie, to talk more
I would love it.
about musicality and AAC. But let's look forward to being proven wrong. Let's look forward to figuring out how we can better our practice. And very often that comes at the cost of realizing, oh, shoot. But it's definitely worth it in the long run. Jamie, do you have any final words for anyone who's listening who is curious about Gestalt language processors and AAC?
Ooh, gosh, you know what? I even thought that this might be a question. You know what? I think honestly, my most And this seems so simple. I think the biggest thing is if you are new to this, one, be open-minded, be willing to unlearn, be willing to be wrong. I know this is now more than one thing, but also never stop learning, because even there were times where I was like, okay, I think I know everything I feel like I can know about AAC and everything I feel like I can know about Gestalt language processing. My nightstand was just covered in articles that I printed out and lived experiences and clinical expertise and everything. And then there was still more to learn, and there's always going to be more to learn. And so I think it's scary when I hear people say, well, I've been doing this for this many years, or well, this is how it's always been done. And I'm like, no, like we don't live by that. And so always being willing to learn and being willing to be wrong, which is something that I was not good at until recently, being willing to be wrong and continue to learn and collaborate. I think that's the biggest takeaway, honestly. And listening to autistic voices, listening to the lived experience of the AAC user, Gestalt language processor, autistic community, neurodivergent community. I think their voices need to be highlighted as much as possible. If that's the culture and community that we're trying to support, their voices should really be the loudest.
Mm-hmm. And being willing to ask better questions. If we're not asking the right questions that reflect the communities we're working with, we got to figure out how to ask better questions, come up with better hypotheses that don't just serve, the people who are engaging in the research, but can we ask the questions that the people we're working with actually want answers to about themselves?
Yes. Oh, so true. Absolutely.
All right, Jamie Burch, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure talking to you about your practice, the way that you're making choices, and your therapeutic decision-making about your clients. And I really look forward to having you back in the future.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Now that you've listened to my conversation with Jamie Burch, I wanted to expand upon the concept of backwards chaining as it applies to multi-step skills for AAC users. Now, I recommend listening to an episode entitled Bringing It All Together, Chaining Procedures in AAC by SLP Nerdcast. This was dropped in October 2020, and it provides a more detailed breakdown of the different types of chaining that you might find in augmentative and alternative communication supports and interventions. Now, some listeners may disagree with this more structured approach to supporting operational competencies with a speech-generating device, preferring instead a much more naturalistic approach to modeling, where the child or client would observe your modeling sequence at their own pace. However, you may be surprised at how often you are already using chaining in your AAC modeling. But perhaps the perception of this approach, because it comes from ABA and pedagogy, is that it's more strict or demanding or requiring compliance, when in fact it may be more aligned with your therapeutic values than you think. And I also want to clarify, as with any clinical ideas in this podcast, that myself and the team, we don't engage in any prescriptivism or one-size-fits-all approach to AAC, GLP, anything. I've worked with plenty of clients for whom backward chaining was not appropriate, not helpful in their learning process. For other clients, a more direct intervention, or one where we could more easily measure the steps towards the operational competency, it supported and fostered more excitement about this new form of communication in their life. We saw that it provided faster access to their recorded gestalts, and it seemed to provide a more efficient path through Light's 1989 AAC competency areas. Now, this prompting technique does draw from behavioral analysis and pedagogy, and I recommend finding out more information about its origins through the journals related to these fields. So, backward chaining is a kind of intervention scaffolding that has a child begin a task closer to the end, rather than starting it from the very first step and moving through the whole sequence to that end goal. Now, it starts towards the end or at the end step, and then it has clear fading support at each involved step in that entire sequence or skill. Now, depending on the child or client's unique profile and learning style, the starting point, which is towards the end, and the speed of prompt reduction must be individualized. Now, gradually, we prompt in ways that move the starting point back. Things like time delay. We all engage in some form of time delay when we're working with our clients, but now we may be able to better measure it and keep track of it with a scaffolding technique like backwards chaining. Now, backward chaining is not a perma technique, as we want our clients to begin their attempts further and further back towards the first step with more and more independence. Initially, we provide intentional and purposeful involvement to present that visual sequence, perhaps increasing curiosity about that end goal and allowing them to witness the entirety of a process to reach that desired goal. Now, when we consider autistic adult experiences where they're sharing that they benefit from seeing the entirety of a process or skill before attempting it themselves, perhaps a child gestalt processor witnessing the full visual access sequence, it could provide what we might consider a visual gestalt to draw from. Now, with augmentative and alternative communication, particularly with speech-generating devices, the hope is that backward chaining does not need to be provided for every single icon over and over. In my practice, we provide input within that prompting hierarchy, which will fade from the initial target icons, and hopefully, and more often than not, it will generalize to novel icons that the child wants to access. For example, I have a client who loves whale sharks. I programmed a button about a whale shark, and then I provided backward chaining, where I modeled that icon about a whale shark when they were playing with one, and they were able to see the cause and effect of I pressed this button of something they love. They then heard the musical gestalt audio recording that I had created. They showed interest in the device. And then the next time, I was providing that visual prompt of me going in backwards through one folder. And so that would be for the water animals folder in the LAMP software that we were using. Now, because of this child's cognitive profile and their learning pace, which is quite fast, I then moved it backwards toward them seeing me press the folder for come. And come is where the animal folders live within. So then, with this very simple backwards chain, the child then realized, oh, I could press the come folder, then the water animals folder, and then arrive at my destination, which is the icon of something I really want to hear about and I really want to talk about. Now, that was the backward chains for one icon, but to relate it back to what I just said, then this child quickly realized, okay, I can hit the come button, open up that folder, then I can open up water animals and then check it out. So many other favorite animals are there. And so through one backward chaining intervention, this child then realized he could open up and access all of the water animals he wanted to talk about. But it generalized even further. And again, I do want to clarify that the cognitive profile of this child allowed for this to happen quite quickly. But he then realized, okay, I open up the come folder, and then look at all these other folders next to it that lead to all the other animals that I might want to talk about. Now, from personal clinical experience, beyond that one anecdote, a majority of clients I've worked with seem to be able to recognize that target icons, gestalts they want to get to, single words they might want to get to, tend to be within 2 to 3 folders or 2 to 3 taps. And I've noticed them engage in some what I call searching skills after that initial set of backward chaining experiences. Once this structural quality of the AAC software is recognized, exploration and intentional target choice tend to flourish. So this was a bit of an expansion on the idea and the technique of backwards chaining. I am genuinely curious as a listener what you think about this technique, whether you knew you already used it or realize that you use it, and if it's something that you disagree with or feel uncomfortable with, I'd love to hear why. Leave a comment on this podcast episode, reach out so that we can have more of a discussion about the techniques that we're using with augmentative and alternative communication, as well as how we're modifying our procedures to meet the needs of Gestalt language processors. I hope you join us again soon for another episode. Thanks so much for joining us on today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We want you to get credit for the hard work you've put in to further your education. We also appreciate your support. We'd love for you to write a quick review of the podcast and subscribe. If you're listening on a streaming platform, feel free to rate us. 5 stars is great, 4 stars is awesome, but we also appreciate honesty around here if it's lower. That way, your ratings and your reviews will help get our podcast to more clinicians like you, as well as parents and people from other professions who might benefit from learning about Gestalt language processing. Now, if you've indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA for you. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. And also, please don't hesitate to tell us which topics you would like us to cover in future episodes. To get in touch, drop us a line in the comments section or send us a message on social media. We'd love to hear who you want us to interview, what topics are on your mind, and where you'd like us to investigate when it comes to the world of GLP. Okay, but here's the really cool part, especially because you listened all the way to the end. For our Gestalt Get-Together listeners, we actually have a special coupon code to receive $20 off any annual subscription to speechtherapypd.com. Head over there to get ASHA CEUs for listening to this podcast and all other episodes. My code is GESTALT20. You're going to put Gestalt in all caps, and that is GESTALT 20. I hope to see you at our next episode.